Hello friends, my name is Ajay, one of your TAs for Comp 423, and welcome to the fourth video of the Introduction to Angular series. In this video, I am going to be introducing Angular modules. You've probably seen .module files while working through EX01 and maybe even EX00, but you're not really probably sure about what they are and how they relate to how our overall application runs. So first, I want to talk about what Angular modules are. And all a module is it is a container or a bundle for files that are related in an Angular application. Usually they are related by a specific feature or a specific purpose. Okay? And what they really allow you to do is that all of the files that are inside of a module or inside of this bundle are able to work with each other. They're able to talk to each other. They automatically import each other. And this is a very, very important concept. And in addition, modules that are these bundles of files, right? We can have multiple modules in a project and multiple bundles of these files. However, one module can import another module and have access to all of its functionality. You can think of modules almost as standalone packages, and we're going to be exploring this as we look at some examples. So when we look at our application, we're going to first look at the app module. And you've probably seen this in a file called app.module.ts. If you remember from the previous video where we talked about routing, and in the video earlier when we talked about creating a new component, we did something called declaring a component inside of our app module file. And you will have noted that when you run the ng-generate component command, it automatically adds a new component that we create to the app module. And really all the app module is a bundle of related files and a bundle of related features. Now the app module loads up and it loads all of the pieces, all of the code inside of it when we load our main application. And this is done in a file called main.ts. And we're going to take a look at this file in a second, very briefly. But main.ts is actually the entry point of our application. It is at the root level of the directory, and I highly recommend that you check it out. And the main.ts file loads our app module. And by loading our app module, we load all of the necessary features, all of the necessary components that we need in order for our application to actually work and load up. In addition, as we talked about, modules can import other modules, right? And so the Angular framework itself, as well as Material UI, or the material design, Angular Material, is the framework that we're using to style our app. And these particular features, these particular items, are also modules that we import into our system. So Angular allows us to have a lot of modules and has a lot of modules for different things. Same with material. For example, if you're using like a material form, as you probably did with the EX01, or maybe any material element like material cards, material snack bars, any of those UI elements, all of those are stored in their own modules within the material package. And we import all of these into our main app module. Now, you probably are not really aware that this is happening because in the starter code that we provided in the CSXL site, this has already been done for you. But if you wanted to access or use a material component that you don't already have, that's not already been imported and has not been used elsewhere in the site, you might run into problems when you try and use it. And that is because that module is most likely not, imported into the app module. And we're going to get into this a little bit in a bit. But the main first thing is talking about what actually goes inside of a module. And when it comes to the app module, the first thing that the first distinction that we have to make is between these modules and then the related routing modules. So routing modules are a little bit different because they're not necessarily as much of a bundle of code, but they allow us to show the correct components when a user provides a route through the Angular routing system. This is something that we talked about a lot in the previous video, and you probably have gained a lot of experience using this. If you remember the front end stack diagram that we drew, on the top left we had that app routing module box, and this is really where this is the same thing. This is the app routing module. However, this is a module in itself, and so this module is imported into our app module file. By importing it, we are then able to use it. And why is this important? Well, this is important because the app routing module, remember, takes the routes of the components inside of our module that we're trying to show at a correct URL. So by importing the app routing module into our app module, it basically means that when we load up our app module from main.ts, our app routing module is also there and is also able to be used. And when that is imported and when that's loaded, when our main.ts file is accessed, that means that the routes that are being provided by the user into the routing system can then be connected to the correct component. Now, our module also does something called declare items. Now, what does declaring mean? Well, declaring is just basically a fancy word for saying that a member, like something that is being declared, is a member of that module. So for example, when I say that the app module declares a component, it basically means that that component is part of the actual module, okay? And so in our module, we declare components, right? That basically means that there are components, Angular components, that are part of our app module. And we'll be looking at this a little bit in more detail in a bit. But for example, in the CSXL project, if you were to go to app.module.ts, you will see that the homepage component, about page component, etc., those are declared in the app module, which means that those components are part of the app module. Now, it's also important to remember that modules declare other things. For example, and also this is another interesting note here that I'm adding with these arrows, is that remember in that diagram how we had our router and then we have our component and we had those two arrows where our component supplies a static route property to our module so that to the router, so that the router knows when to show the page. That is also displayed in this diagram here. So you can see that it's the same thing as before. The component passes a route property to the router, and then given whenever the user types in that correct URL, it then displays the page. And that is still the same. But as I was saying, there are other things that our app routing module also declares. For example, widgets. So widgets is something that you all read about in the reading and maybe are beginning to work with a little bit. And widgets are also part of modules. Now, when you read that reading, there was a bit of an introduction to the shared module versus the individual modules, and we'll be getting to that a little bit more in this video. But just like components, widgets can be declared in the module. And what's very important to note is that when a widget is declared in a module, a component that's declared in the same module can have access to that widget. So for example, if I create a search bar widget and it's declared by my app module, then any other page in my app module or declared by that app module can use that widget. So for example, if the about page is declared by the app module, then I can use that widget that I created, that search bar widget. In addition, pretty much all of my components can use it within that app module can use that widget. Now, a component in a different module won't be able to use that widget unless the module that the widget is in is imported. And I'll be showing that in another example. But let's say I had, app module and my search bar widget is in my app module, but then I have another module, let me call it the Chris module, and there's another page in that module, and those modules are not connected, they're not imported, in any way, then a component in my Chris module wouldn't be able to use the widget in my app module. I'll be showing this a little bit more in detail in a second. And then lastly, there's something called pipes in Angular. I don't believe that we've really gotten to this yet, but it will be something in the future that we might use. Pipes are basically a fancy way to transform data, and that's also declared by modules, but you don't really need to worry about that too much for now. Now, this is a bit of a snapshot into that main.ts file, right? And so you can see in the beginning, we run our file. We have these 8 lines of code here that's kind of in the screenshot. You notice though on line 6 that we have this .bootstrap module, and then we have this app module passed into it. Right? And we import it on line 3, we pass it in, and that is really performing what we saw in our first arrow, right? Over here on the left-hand side, where the main.ts file loads our app module, and our app module is the first module that loads up in our project, and that allows us to see all of the pages that we are working with. right? So that is the main.ts file. And we rarely, if not ever, spend time in this file, but it's very useful to understand how everything works. And you can always take a look at the main.ts file as well in the project, right? Now, this is an example of the actual app module.ts file from the CSXL site. And you will see that we have this list in this @ng module decorator, right? So our module is a class, just like components were a class and service were a class. And just like how components had the @component decorator and services use the @injectable decorator, modules use the @ng module decorator, right? So there's a lot of decorators that Angular provides, and this ng module decorator is basically going to say that the class below it is a module. And in my decorator, and you can see this decorator is very, very long, right? It goes off the page here, and if you go to the main app.module.ts file, it is very, very tall. But there are two main pieces which are important to note here. First, we have a list of what we call declarations, and then we put in a bunch of classes. Remember that declarations, anything that is declared by a module, is part of that module. So for example, if I go back to this diagram, right, we have components, widgets, and pipes. These are declared by our module, which means that these pieces are part of my module and can use other code in my module. So if we look here at this list of declarations, we are declaring, for example, app component, home component, about component, gate component, profile editor component. These are all components that are being declared in the app module, which means that they're all part of the app module and they can, interact with each other and access each other. If you, when you're working in the EXO1 with your productivity component, you probably also use this, the app module, and any intro assignment, even in the future, in future semesters, you will likely, declare that component in the app module. And then below, you will also see that we have a list, and this is a list of imports, right? And you can see these are imports from Angular. So these are modules that are created by Angular that we're importing. For example, we have our HTTP client module, React Forms module. You can see it down here. We have Matte button module from Material UI, and that list goes on. In addition, you'll also see in this list is the app routing module. So remember that, as we talked about before, the routing module is imported into our overall module, and so that is in our list too. Now, this is a relatively simple, a more simple diagram using just one module. However, in the main CSXL site, we don't use just one module. And the main reason for this is because think about this from a load time perspective, right? There are a lot of features in the CSXL site, and if you work on actual production code bases with Angular in other places, let's say in industry, those are very, very large projects. And what happens is that when you load, for example, this from main.ts, you load the app module. Everything in a module is loaded in the browser when you access that module. And so if you put all of your features in one module, not only does that's not really good for organization's sake in your code, but also your overall load time is going to be very, very large, because now you're loading so many files, even though you might not need those files. And so what the architecture of the CSXL web app tries to accomplish is it separates larger features into its own module, so that module only loads when you try and access that feature, right? So instead of loading everything in the entire site, right? Like if I'm just trying to access CSXL or CS department organizations, instead of just loading everything, like loading academics, co-working, loading all the events, loading everything, we just load what we need for the organization feature to work, right? And so that can be shown here. We can create individual modules for all of our features. So for example, co-working can have its own module, which declares its own components and has its own routing module, right? So everything at the /components in their URL and on can basically just use our co-working module. Same thing for organizations. We can create our own module for organizations. It can have all of the organization components and widgets and everything in one module. And we can have one routing module that controls routing within that. So within the @/organizations route, right? So how does this actually work? Because we have our main.ts file, which loads our app module. And then we have all these other modules floating around. So how do we get all this connected? And actually, it is the job of the app routing module to load our other modules when needed. So for example, when I go to the /coworking route, right, my app routing module should load the coworking module and everything inside of it. If I instead go to /organization, or /organizations, depending on what it is, it should load the organization module and everything related to it. And I want to show you a snippet from the app routing module. So you can go to app.routing.module.ts and you'll see this. And this allows us, you can see here that we have path organizations. So it's saying when we go to the organizations page, but instead of having a component, remember in the past we had that static route. I had a path, a title, and a component. Instead of passing in a component, we pass in this load children function. And you notice that we say import, and then we import our organization module, so this entire thing, and then we have this then m to m.organization module. Basically what this does is it loads our organization module and everything in it when we go to the /organization route. Right? So this makes it really, really nice because now we can basically load certain features at once whenever we go to that route. So instead of loading everything all at once in the entire site, we just load the features that we need when we go to specific routes. And so this is a very, very nice system, and this is the way that our main app works. Now, in addition, if you read from the widgets reading, you probably recognize, or you probably remember something called the shared module. And the shared module is another module, just like all the other ones, but it contains widgets that should be shared across modules. Why is this important? Well, because remember, if we have our widgets in certain modules, like let's say I have a widget that's in my organization module, but then I want to access that widget from my co-working module, I can't, because the only way to access something in the organization module from co-working module is to import the organization module into the co-working module. And if we do that, if we import organization module into our co-working module, that means that whenever we load our /coworking route, both modules are going to load because we load our co-working module and then we're also importing organization module, so we need to load that too. And that pretty much defeats the entire purpose of having the separation in the first place. So instead, we can create a third module out here called the shared module, which basically, just contains the modules that should be shared between different modules. It contains the shared widgets that are to be shared amongst all the modules. And then from there, we can just import that shared module when needed, right? If you almost think about it, it's like the service with Angular where you just kind of inject them into components that you need. Right here, we have a shared module, and our shared module can now be used and imported into any module that needs to access it. And this is better because now we're only sharing those widgets that we need to share instead of loading an entire module with a bunch of code and a bunch of components and all of that. So it helps to keep the modularity there, and it helps to solve that load time issue. Now this is another diagram. So we had that front end stack diagram with all of our pieces. This is another diagram that I highly recommend that you think about. In reality, all of these diagrams represent similar things, right? Like we had a component, then we had a service, we had the routing module. That was one box in our front end diagram. That was a very simple box just to show how the pieces interact. This is maybe more of a zoom out to say, okay, well outside of that diagram may have just been for one module. Now let's zoom out and let's look at multiple modules. And in the end, you have these web of modules with imports and loading, and this is the main architecture of the CSXL site. And it may seem very confusing at first, but in the end, this will actually help you organize your code a lot better, and it allows you to work in smaller chunks. Now, it's not required for EX01 to have to create your own module. However, it is an optional challenge. So if you wanted to put your new feature that you're working on in a module on its own and load it up in the same way as co-working module or organization module or academics module, highly recommend trying it out because it's a good learning experience. And you can always use the existing modules that exist here, like organization and co-working, as a guide to see to check out and maybe model your new module off of that. Now, the last thing that I wanted to kind of point to here is an error that you may have gotten at some point, either with working with your widgets or working with your components. And this error says something like, X, some element, is not a known element. It says, if it is a component, verify that it's part of this module. You see that as part 1. You probably had no idea what this means, but now it might be a little bit easier to debug this error. Because what it's saying is that if what you're trying to reference in your HTML cannot be found, right, make sure that it's accessible from the module that you're in, right? Because, for example, in this code, in this screenshot, you can see that organization card is highlighted red, right? So organization card is a widget. So what we might be able to tell is, okay, well, if it's saying, that it's not known and that verify it's a part of this module, it might be the case that organization card is not declared in the same module we're using. So therefore, we can't access that widget because it's not in the same module. Or we're not importing the module that my widget is in. And so therefore, I can't access it. So this might help you to think about how to debug certain errors like this, and how, from certain components, what are the other components and widgets you can access, right? Based on what's declared in the module you're in and what other modules your current module is importing. So this is a very important thing to remember, which is just make sure that you declare your widgets and components in the right place. All right, everyone, this is the last part of the video, something that I wanted to very briefly go over. This is a somewhat unneat diagram that I drew up, where we have a app module here. We have 2 components and 2 widgets. And you can see that whenever we have everything is inside of one module, everything in the module can access each other, right? So this widget can access this widget can access the component, and vice versa. Everything within this bubble, which is one module, can access each other. Same thing here. We have a shared module, and this shared module contains 3 widgets inside of it, and these 3 widgets can also access each other. And then finally, we can import our shared module into our app module so that everything in our app module can now access our widgets in the shared module. And so this is more of a visual representation of what is going on, and it's similar to what was in the diagram. But the reason why I wanted to point this out is because you're probably wondering that in my diagram that I drew with the declarations and imports, I never talked about services. Services were not declared by the module, they weren't imported by the module. Why is that? And this is because, and this is something that might be hard to think about at first, but our services actually exist independently from the module system, right? Our services don't load, kind of based on a certain module. The reason is because we can use services across components. And so our services are actually used in a separate way by what is known as the Angular dependency injection system. All of our services are marked with the @injectable, right, decorator, as you know, and that allows us to inject these into our components. What that means, though, is that this is kind of a different level. So instead of having our modules and where we have some services module that we then import to access the services, or we say, oh, a service is actually in here, and then everything in our module can use it. That's not really how it works. Instead, our services exist and are injected into components by the dependency injection system. So the dependency injection system will inject, for example, if this component uses service A, right, this would be an injection. So injects. In addition, this widget could use service A, and you can see that multiple items can inject a service, as we know. And for example, service B, this component might inject this service, but also something in a different module can inject the same service. So for example, if I kind of draw this, I'll try and draw this rather straight. This widget over here can also inject my service. And so the reason why this is important to remember is that regardless of the module that you're in, services are globally available. So anything, if you have a service, any component in any module should be able to properly inject that service. Something very important to think about and something important to remember as to, when you're creating your modules, you might be wondering, okay, well, if I have my, permission service, which is inside of my app module, or it's like in the same folder, does that mean that my organization's component can't use it? No, right? Services are independent of this entire thing and can be injected wherever. So that's just something that is important to consider and to think about as you are working with expanding your application and adding more features. All right, everyone, that is it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to find us in office hours. If you like the video, feel free to like it on YouTube, and see you all in the next one.